The desert does not sleep. Even when the stars turn pale and the winds rest, the sands of Giza continue to breathe, slow, steady, ancient. Beneath that breath lies something older than the pyramids, older than the names carved upon their stones. Between the paws of the Great Sphinx, where the limestone darkens with shadow, the air feels different, charged, trembling, as if time itself were holding its breath. It was here that explorers once knelt with trembling hands. In 1817, Captain Giovanni Caviglia cleared the sands that had swallowed the Sphinx's chest. Later, in the 1920s, Émile Baraïs uncovered the temple at its base. Yet even after centuries of excavation, there remains a silence that no spade has broken, the whisper of something unseen beneath the rock. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions speak of Shetepank, the place of rest for the living spirit. Some believe this is what sleeps below, a chamber built not for a body, but for breath, the eternal rhythm of creation itself. A scholar stands there now at the edge of night. He is nameless because his purpose is not to be known. He carries a single lantern, its light trembling like a prayer in the wind. The Sphinx towers above him, its face eroded yet eternal, its eyes fixed upon Orion's rising stars, the same constellation that guided the builders of the pyramids, the same alignment that binds heaven and earth in the geometry of faith. The scholar feels the hum beneath his feet, a faint vibration, as though the desert were exhaling beneath him. He presses his palm to the stone, and it feels warm, perhaps from the sun that has touched it for 5,000 years, perhaps from something deeper. Legends tell of sealed corridors leading from the Sphinx toward the Pyramid of Khafre, of rooms filled not with treasure but with tablets of forgotten knowledge. The Hall of Records, a library said to contain the memory of a lost civilization before Egypt itself. The scholar does not seek proof. He seeks silence, the kind that listens back. He moves closer, tracing the faint hieroglyphs near the chest. Falcons, serpents, spirals of wind and breath. The torchlight flickers, revealing patterns that seem to pulse as if alive. Beneath the limestone, the wind grows heavier, slower, rhythmic, like the breathing of something vast and buried. He feels it through the soles of his feet, through the bones of his chest. The air trembles, not with fear but with reverence. He remembers reading of the dream stele, that granite tablet placed by Thutmose IV between the Sphinx's paws, where the young prince wrote that the god appeared to him in sleep and promised the throne if he cleared the sands. The stele remains to this day, a record of a dream that changed the course of a kingdom. Perhaps this chamber, too, is a dream, carved not by hands but by the memory of something divine. The seeker lowers himself onto the sand. Around him, the dunes glow faintly under starlight, soft and infinite. The breath beneath the stone grows gentler now, as if recognizing him. He imagines the priests of the Old Kingdom, their chants rising like dust in morning light, invoking the god of air, Shu, who separated sky from earth. Perhaps this chamber was not built for death at all, but for the first breath, the one that gave the world its name. A sound moves through the night, not wind, not stone, but a vibration felt in the chest, the pulse of a living earth. The scholar closes his eyes. He no longer seeks the entrance. The revelation has already opened. The chamber beneath the Sphinx is not hidden in sand or rock, but within the silence that listens when all words fall away. He stands a long time, until the first star writes its small syllable above the lion's brow. Then he breathes with the stone, the old labor's tempo returning to his chest. In for the lift, out for the set, in for the measure, out for the rest. He understands that the hymn continues exactly as long as someone is willing to breathe with it. He takes one more slow breath and steps back into the night that keeps their faces and forgets their names. Perhaps the builders never needed names where they placed their hands. Perhaps the stone remembered for them, and the breath made a ledger no wind could erase. The Sphinx receives the dark. The valley takes the last warmth and holds it, and the hymn, quiet, patient, star-marked, goes on. The scholar could not sleep. The desert had fallen into its deepest stillness, that hour before dawn when sound folds inward, and even the wind seems to listen. The air was dry, yet beneath the silence, he felt something moving. Not wind, not breath, something slower, heavier, ancient, a pulse beneath the sand. He rose, took his lantern, and walked toward the base of the plateau. The dunes gleamed faintly under a half-moon, their curves like waves frozen mid-motion. The air carried the taste of salt and limestone, the memory of a sea that had long withdrawn. He thought of the old stories, the ones travelers spoke in hushed tones. That beneath the Giza Plateau, beneath the paws of the Sphinx and the foundations of the pyramids, a river still ran, a river unseen, older than the Nile itself. It was not entirely legend. He remembered the words of an engineer named Hamad, who once wrote of subterranean fissures discovered during restoration work, channels cut through limestone, damp with hidden moisture. In the 1990s, hydrogeologists found traces of ancient aquifers beneath the plateau, where groundwater flowed through porous stone. The ancients, it seemed, had known of it too. They called it the breath of Osiris, the living water that linked the worlds of the dead and the living. The scholar descended into a shallow depression near the temple ruins. There, between the scattered blocks, a crack in the rock exhaled cool air. He knelt beside it. The temperature was lower here, the air richer, tinged with the scent of minerals and thyme. He closed his eyes. Beneath the hum of the desert, he could hear it, the faint murmur of water moving through stone. He thought of the Nile in its glory, the great artery of Egypt called Itaru, the river. Each year it rose, spilled its silt, and retreated, leaving the black soil that gave the land its name, Kemet. Life and death both came by that river. But what of this one, buried and unseen? Perhaps it was not a river of water alone, but of memory, carrying the voices of those who had built, prayed, and perished here. He leaned closer to the fissure. The sound deepened, echoing faintly like a song from far below. He imagined the ancient priests descending through hidden tunnels, pouring libations into cracks in the stone so that offerings might reach the underworld. The pyramid text spoke of the dead king sailing across the sky by day and traveling beneath the earth by night, through rivers of darkness guided by the goddess Meheweret, the celestial cow of the flood. Perhaps, he thought, those rivers were not metaphors at all. Perhaps they were real, hidden courses of water threading the desert's heart, sacred arteries in the body of the earth. His lantern flickered, its flame bending toward the fissure. The air moved again, a sigh rising from the depths. He felt a tremor under his knees. The sand shifted slightly, whispering against the stone. He stayed still. The sound grew, not loud, not fearful, but rhythmic, like a heartbeat through layers of time. The scholar whispered a line from a hymn of Abydos. The breath beneath the stone continues, slow, eternal. Hail to you, hidden stream, who waters the roots of heaven. A faint mist rose, cold against his face. It shimmered, catching the lantern's glow. For an instant, it seemed to hold shapes, figures of men and women carrying jars, walking across a reflected sky. Then the light trembled, and they were gone. He exhaled slowly. His hands were wet. He lifted them and saw a trace of moisture, fine, mineral-rich, glimmering like tears of the earth. He smiled softly. This was no dream. Beneath all this silence, the desert still remembered how to flow. When he returned to his camp, the horizon was already silver. He sat and wrote, "The river beneath is not water alone. It is the continuity of all motion, the persistence of breath beneath stillness. The ancients called it life. We call it erosion. Both words mean the same thing, what endures while changing." As the sun rose, he watched its light crawl slowly across the Sphinx's face. The stone seemed to wake, glowing as if lit from within. Perhaps the old builders had chosen this place because they knew, somewhere beneath the paws, the desert was never dry. Even in silence, something moved, flowing toward eternity. The scholar closed his eyes, feeling the faint vibration through the ground. The same pulse that had guided kings and dreamers still moved underfoot. And for the first time he understood. The Sphinx did not merely guard secrets. It listened to the song of the hidden river, to the murmur of the past. The wind stirred, the sand shifted, and beneath it all, the water kept its vow. The scholar walked before sunrise, when the plateau keeps its most delicate promises. The air was blue and breathless, and the ground remembered the night. East of the Sphinx, where the earth lowers into a quiet rectangle of shadow, he found the threshold he had been tracing with his steps for days. A field of pillars and sockets, of bases waiting for weight that never came. The limestone glowed faintly, unexpected as embers under ash. This was a temple, yet it felt more like a pause, a gesture half completed, a prayer interrupted not by neglect but by revelation. He had read of this place in crumbling reports. A sanctuary paired with the Sphinx and the Valley Temple, blocks quarried from the same trench that gave the lion its body, faces once cased in granite, alignment listening to the morning. Some corpses sat perfectly dressed, their joints tight and cool. Others exposed raw edges where a craftsman had laid down his tool to answer a different call. Toward the eastern lip, sockets opened like shallow cups awaiting columns that never rose. Around them, scores from copper chisels kept the rhythm of hands that had withdrawn mid-phrase. He knelt beside one of the sockets and ran a finger along its rim. The cut was clean, the intention clear. The absence felt deliberate, like the white space around a hieroglyph that allows the sign to breathe. And the desert exhales once more. Dawn gathered slowly. The Sphinx turned from stone into attention. The scholar stood within the unfinished colonnade and watched the first line of light climb the western wall and spill forward, calm as water finding its channel. This was the hour the builders had tuned for. Whatever halted their work, the sun itself had completed the ceremony each day since. He could almost hear the master's instruction still ringing in the air. Stand the pillar not for height, but for light. Shape the opening so the first breath of morning can walk through without haste. He pressed his palm to a block whose face still bore the ghosts of quarry marks. This stone had traveled only a short distance from its native bed, up and over on sledges watered by boys with clay jars, laid to rest at a measured angle to greet the horizon. Other blocks in the wall wore a different skin, the hard polish of granite cladding once fitted tight as a thought, now gone in places, revealing the warm bone of limestone beneath. The temple was layered like a memory, casing and core, intention and revision, finish and pause. He thought of the Sphinx temple nearby, its megaliths nested like sleeping beasts, corners squared to a precision that could make a breath sharpen. This place felt kin to it, yet softened at the edges, as if the builders had chosen to let dawn complete the geometry they had only begun. He set his lamp upon a fallen lintel, though he did not light it. The rising light moved its reflection gently across the brass. A thin river there on metal, here on stone. He walked the periphery, counting steps not to measure but to memorize. 3 slow strides between each base. 7 from the threshold to the center. 9 to the eastern edge where the ground fell away into the plateau's older scars. He noted how the floor dipped slightly near the mouth, where rare rain might collect and return the sky to itself. He wondered if a worker, hundreds of years after the temple paused, had stood in such a pool and seen the columns he carried in his heart rising in the reflection. He remembered passages from Old Kingdom texts, the sun reborn in the eastern horizon, the temple as an open mouth for the first utterance of day. He murmured the line under his breath, the words moving like a reed boat across his chest. It was not a lecture he sought, not even certainty, but participation. To stand in their ritual until his breathing matched the slow syllables of light. He thought of the goddess Seshet, measuring cord in hand, and of the forgotten foreman who must have pointed to this very threshold and nodded once, knowing the line was right. He thought, too, of the day the line of work had folded into the line of leaving, an order to stop, a flood, a change in power, a revelation that the temple's purpose was to remain unfinished so that dawn could forever be in the act of arriving. The plateau brightened, chalk and honey. Sparrows stitched quick curves through the open roof, tracing columns that never rose. In their flight, the scholar felt the absent shafts taking form, not as stone but as motion, each arc a transparent pillar transmitting morning downward. Far off, the village woke in low voices. The Sphinx steadied the east with its gaze. The scholar stepped into the center where a lintel might have crossed one day, and stood beneath the empty sky like a visitor to a basilica whose vaults have not yet been dreamt. The sun's rim lifted, and a single beam entered unobstructed, crossing the floor at a shallow angle. It found his hand on the stone and warmed it. He closed his eyes and let the beam travel through him, as if he were only another base awaiting a true weight, a task he would not hurry to receive. When he opened his eyes, he noticed the small things builders leave when time glides past them. A shallow groove where rope had worried an edge smooth. A thin red line brushed in pigment as a guide for a cut not taken. A chip preserved inside a joint like a trapped breath. In the shadow of a half-raised jam, a footprint had hardened in old slurry, narrow heel, long toes. A woman's, perhaps, who mixed mortar and counted syllables while she stirred, who laid her palm on stone when no one watched and lent it part of her patience. Unfinished did not mean abandoned. It meant the work had passed into another material. Light, air, the daily vow of the East to arrive. He sat on the lintel and wrote in his notebook without looking down. A temple pauses when it chooses the sky as its roof. Completion is a human hunger. The morning does not share it. It keeps becoming. He did not embellish it. He only watched the slow braid of shadow and shine across the floor, the way the day's first color filled the sockets like offerings of brightness. He imagined columns of reed and cloth erected only for a festival, then gone. Imagined hymns whispered between bases when wine stood still. Imagined the old keeper from the causeway pausing here to rest his lamp and say nothing for 10 breaths, letting the 10th grow longer until the door opened and he knew the temple's threshold had moved into him. By mid-morning the light lost its ceremonial angle and became merely day. The spell did not break. It laid down content. The scholar rose and walked to the eastern edge once more. Beyond, the desert rolled toward a horizon the Sphinx had learned by heart. The unfinished temple held a quiet at his back that felt like a hand between his shoulder blades. Not pushing, only reminding him that a path continues even when one sits. He turned and bowed to the sleepers in the stone. The woman's footprint, the foreman's red line, the sockets cupping their invisible pillars. He placed his palm on the threshold. The stone was warm now. It did not ask for promise or proof. It asked for nothing. He understood that some sanctuaries remain open by remaining incomplete, that some questions keep blessing us by never finishing their sentence. He stepped away very slowly, careful not to disturb the bright water pooling in a shallow cut where the sky had gathered itself. He left the lamp unlit, trusting the sun to carry what needed carrying. As he climbed back toward the Sphinx, he did not look over his shoulder. The temple remained behind him like a word he would refrain from saying aloud, not from fear, but from respect. A new breeze rose and moved through the empty colonnade and made a sound like pages turning. He knew no book lay there. The sound was simply the morning practicing its own reading. Perhaps Egypt was never guarding a secret. Perhaps the pillar that matters most is the one we cannot lift. Perhaps the dawn prefers to rest on air. The scholar let that thought enter him without needing to own it. By the time he reached the lion's paws, the sky had become bright enough to erase its own origin. The moment of first light was gone, but not spent. It had joined the others here, the long shelf of beginnings that make a life. He stood very still and allowed the unfinished to complete him, just enough for walking. He breathed once, twice, with the measured gentleness the builders had left behind. He did not close the chapter. He placed a finger in the seam and held the place for tomorrow. The temple would be waiting, not to be finished, but to keep beginning. The scholar waited until the second night wind, the one that follows the cooling of stone and carries the scent of limestone like a pale incense. The plateau had emptied. The last murmurs from the village had folded inward. He wore the quiet like a cloak. At the paws of the Sphinx, where the granite steel dreams and the limestone remembers, he lowered his lantern without lighting it and let the moon lend its colder flame. He had come not to break anything, but to listen for the place where listening itself becomes a door. He traced the familiar courses with his fingertips. The chisels of restorers had passed here. The measured hands of surveyors had paused here. The wind had written its long script between. Near the southern flank, the bedrock showed a seam no map would bother to note, no more than a palm's breadth of shadow, a change in the rock's breath. Instruments had, in other seasons, suggested hollows under the enclosure, regions where density softened and sound returned a longer echo. He did not bring charts. He carried a notebook and a patience old enough to be mistaken for stone. He bent and touched that seam. The night answered with a barely cooler exhalation, as if some chamber far within the body of the plateau relieved itself of one long sigh. He did not pry. He laid his ear to the skin of the Sphinx's trench wall and waited. At first, only the small orchestra of the desert. A grain of sand ticking down a niche, a moth testing the lantern's unlit glass, a dog far away remaking its dream into a bark. Then, under these, a softer measure, rhythmic, infrequent, like a long tide felt through bedrock. The scholar closed his eyes and matched it with his breath. He remembered the hours he had spent at the dream steel, reading the faltering lines of Thutmose's sleep and vow. He remembered the debates he had heard in the mouths of others, of hidden passages, of records stored against the forgetfulness of sun and empire. He allowed the legends to pass over him the way sand passes over a stone and does not move it. The Sphinx, he felt, kept less a secret than a discipline. Gates' answer to the rhythm of vows. In his pocket, the small brass compass lay warm from his palm. He set it on the limestone, not for direction but for company, and took from the notebook a slip of paper, creased from years. The diagram the gentle team had once left him, dotted lines that meant more caution than claim. He folded it again and slid it away. Paper can yearn. Stone can only be. He began a soft rite he had invented the night he met the watchman. 10 breaths taken with the rock, letting the 10th lengthen if it wished. On the 7th, the seam drew a deeper chill along his cheek. On the 8th, the sand at his knee shifted as if it had remembered it was a river. On the 9th, a long moth of shadow passed across the moon, and every line in the Sphinx's face grew tender and older at once. On the 10th, the breath lengthened of itself, and something quiet yielded, not outward, but inward, like a muscle releasing in the heart of a sleeping animal. He opened his eyes into the same darkness, and yet the space felt larger, as if a wall of air had stepped aside. He did not move at first. He listened to the way sound now lay in the trench. Less flat, more kind. He slid his palm along the seam and found a narrow recess big enough for a hand whose fingers did not grasp. He slid his hand inside, not like a key, but like a blessing. There is a moment when touch ceases to ask and begins to answer. The limestone beneath his fingertips was cool, then cool with intention, a temperature recorded by centuries of shade. He felt, along the recess, the careful toolwork of someone who had expected readers without expecting visitors. The faintest score of a chisel, the slope that encourages a palm to rest rather than push. He closed his hand, withdrew, and placed that coolness upon his own chest as if returning a coin to an older treasury. Perhaps it was only teaching us how to listen. He whispered a single name, no kings, no gods, only the name of breath in the ancient tongue, Ka. The trench, without echo, received it. He whispered the word for name itself, Ren. He did not speak Shut, the shadow, because the night was full of it. Words did not open anything. They tuned the room that the mind makes around the heart. Under his knees, the ground carried the water's thread he had learned to hear 2 nights before. Beneath the earth and its long bones, a thin runnel crossed the plateau the way a memory crosses a face. Not to rearrange it, but to soften it into likeness with itself. The scholar realized that if there were a passage here, it would not travel where feet go. It would travel where echo goes, following the line of least resistance through limestone and time until it arrived in a chamber built with the oldest human material. Silence shaped by intention. He did not search. He prepared. He placed the unlit lantern beside the seam and sat, back straight against the mild wall, as if he were keeping watch in a small sanctuary. He recited not spells but syllables of the morning he had learned in the unfinished temple. In for the lift, out for the set, in for the measure, out for the rest. He waited until the breath forgot to measure itself. Then, as if a curtain of absence grew translucent, the night widened again. He did not see stones swing, or hear hinges remember their tasks. He knew only that another air now mingled with the deserts. Older, colder, faintly sweet, the odor of deep limestone that has held itself still and clean for geologic patience. In that air lived the knowledge of tools put down in reverence, the warmth of bodies that had left no ash, the dust of words that had chosen to become the room rather than remain speech. He did not lift the lamp. He cupped his hands and carried that new air as one carries water, not to drink, but to feel its weight. He understood with a clarity that did not need light. The gate was not an aperture in rock. It was a fidelity in the one who approached. Those who demanded were given angles and denials. Those who matched their pulse to the deserts, who arrived with vows and left with fewer words than they brought. Those found a gate already open, because they had become its hinge. He leaned forward and placed his brow against the stone. The contact was intimate, like the last note of a prayer that asks nothing. A sound traveled through the rock then, not from within but from the entire plateau at once. The same long chord the builders had left, now softened by a river's far pulse and the flight of sparrows across a roof that never was. In that chord lived every hand. In that chord slept the map of forgotten light. In that chord breathed the promise that dawn need not finish to be complete. He withdrew, left palm against the seam as one leaves a small heat in a child's bed before standing. The cooler air remained. The gate did not close because it had not opened. It had always been here, at the measure where attention becomes devotion. He understood why no report could certify it and no diagram could convince. Certainty is not what the gate guards. Keeps, instead, the practice that changes the one who comes. At last he lit the lantern, not to see, but to mark the hour. The flame made a small orb of amber that touched the stone and retreated. It was enough. He bowed to the seam, to the trench, to the lion's patient face, to the steel that dreams aloud, to the old watchman whose lamp taught him the right. He brushed the dust from his knees as from a page he would keep reading tomorrow. He left the lantern dark again and walked backward 3 steps, then turned toward the valley where the first paleness gathers long before day. Behind him, the Sphinx did not move. Before him, the air altered field by field, the night becoming a lighter kind of listening. He did not look over his shoulder. He had entered as far as a person may enter without breaking the thing he loves. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was meant to be kept by those who let themselves be kept by it. The wind changed, soft as breath against the seam of the world. In that change, the scholar felt the hinge again, the small rightness by which doors do not swing, but hearts do. Night settles again upon the plateau, and the wind moves through the stones like a whisper remembering its own birth. Beneath the vast and star-drenched silence, the Sphinx keeps its eternal vigil, watching a horizon that no longer belongs to the living. Yet somewhere, beneath the layers of limestone and breath, there is said to be a hollow, a chamber whose very walls remember sound. He walked until the trench lifted him to the level of the pause. The granite in shadow, the limestone in moon, the steel's worn promise. The whole became one long, lucid breath. The lantern stayed dark in his hand. The gate where silence begins continued to begin, untroubled by footsteps, unstirred by claim. He bowed his head once more, not to end anything, but to leave space where endings go when they are not needed. And the night, faithful to its charge, closed not upon him, but around him as a room closes kindly around a sleeper. The lantern stayed dark in his hand. He did not need it. The air itself carried a pale knowing, a coolness that rose from the limestone as if the rock had been keeping a secret breath for millennia and now shared a measure of it with a quiet guest. He slipped along the interior seam, not a corridor, not a passage as a mason would mark, but a narrowing of silence shaped by intention, and entered a room that could not be drawn, only received. The ground leveled beneath his feet. Somewhere above, a weight beyond counting rested on the desert's long ribs. Down here, the weight felt like a calm hand on a brow. The scholar lifted his own hand and found nothing. That was its welcome. He stood without moving. The chamber answered with a hush, so even it became a kind of music. A shift of gravel, the softest settling of dust, the slow contraction of stone as night moved through it. each sound placed at such distance that the room became wider than map and closer than skin. He thought, in passing, of those who had measured the plateau with seismic pulses and careful charts, of hollow signals returned to questioning instruments long before his knees had learned to bend like this. He did not contest their graphs. He let them fade like scaffolding after a restoration, leaving the work to stand on its own, a space arranged for breath. He remembered what the old texts called a false door, carved in tombs to invite the Ka, the life breath, to cross between rooms of world and afterworld. He sat where the floor sloped into a shallow bowl, as if a palm had been pressed here repeatedly until the limestone learned the curve by heart. Moisture lived faintly in that shallow. The same mineral sweetness he had tasted by the fissure nights ago cooled his fingertips. He cupped his hands and lifted nothing, yet felt them grow heavier, as if memory were a form of water that could be carried without wetting the skin. He rested his palms on his knees and watched, with closed eyes, the way darkness conducts its own dawn. A slow light that never brightens, only clarifies. Facts rose like constellations at the edge of vision and settled where they belonged. There was the dream steel above, red granite worn thin, its promise still unspent. There were the massive core stones of the valley temple, quarried from the Sphinx's trench, fitted so tight the desert's breath ran along them like a whispered hymn. There were the reports of restorers, Barai's sand lifted like sleep from a face, Salim Hassan's trenches, Mariette's patient hands, each a verse in the long psalm of careful touch. He let each fact become a star, then let the pattern between them draw itself, not as a proof but as a map for the part of him that could not be named and did not mind. He breathed with the chamber. It breathed back. The rhythm was slow enough to measure seasons. In-breath, the rock's pores gathering night colth, the water thread beneath turning in its dark cradle, the whole plateau rounding its shoulder toward the east. Out-breath, a loosening through the ribs of stone, a gift of air older than any dynasty, a barely tangible blessing that softened the scholar's chest until it felt not like a room inside him, but like a gate kept ajar on purpose. He realized he had not thought of discovery since he entered. He had been discovered, and the room was deciding to keep him. At the far side, where attention learned to arrive before the eyes, he felt a gradation. Not an opening, not a wall. A thinning of presence that made him wish to stand and bow to whatever had chosen to be less dense there. He did not go. He understood the ethics of thresholds. Some are crossed by standing still. He placed his palm on the floor and traced a slow spiral, an old gesture of greeting to places that do not use speech. The stone was neither warm nor cold. It was exact. It offered the temperature of acceptance. The scholar remembered a line copied in his notebook. To free the body from the sand. He saw now that the vow had never belonged only to a prince and a statue. Beneath everything, the desert, too, wished to be freed. Not from itself, but into its truest form. A place where movement could rest and resting could move. The chamber was the desert's own remembrance of water shaped into stillness. He felt the earlier chapters of his journey gather around him without edge or sequence. The mirror of dawn on an empty page, the watchman's lamp, the cartographer's dotted lines, the hymn of hands, the river beneath, the unfinished pillars tuned to morning, the seam where silence begins. Each arrived and took a seat, not to testify, but to keep company in a room that needed no audience and permitted no applause. Long before the empires of men learned to write, the ancients believed that words carried power beyond flesh, that a single syllable could awaken eternity. Within temples along the Nile, priests recorded not only what was seen, but what was heard. The hymns that shaped the gods, the chants that aligned the stars. Those who built the Sphinx, whether in the age of Khafre or before, may have carved not only a monument of stone but an instrument of resonance, a voice for the desert itself. He let his breathing lengthen beyond counting. The bones behind his ears loosened. The skin of his face forgot its inheritance of effort. He had read that paint once covered the Sphinx in ochre and blue. He felt that color now in the dark as a low radiance, not seen, only received. He had read of gold on the brow. He felt its warmth around the crown of his head, as if the chamber remembered the sun on behalf of those who enter without it. Light, it seemed, had never been absent here. It had only learned to breathe without noticing itself. The scholar understood, not suddenly, but with the unhurried surety of dew forming, that the room had no center and that this was its center. He understood that chambers require walls. Sanctuaries require vows. He had brought one without knowing. The willingness to let his name slip into the air and be returned to him thinner and truer. He felt the syllables of that name, the ones the day used for him, drift like dust motes in a slow current, and felt no need to catch them. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. He listened until even listening wore no edges. Past and present folded like hands at rest. He saw boats carved in stars, cow horns cradling the newborn light, fields of reeds that whispered not of harvest, but of gentleness. He saw neither kings nor tombs, only breath remembering itself across a vastness that had learned not to measure. He did not ask for a sign. He received one. A single drop sounded in the dark, a note so soft it could have been the memory of a drop. It landed in the shallow bowl the stone had kept for it and spread a ring he could not see, only know. The chamber answered, and for a long moment the plateau above felt as light as a palm lifted to bless a child. He bowed. The posture did not change the room. It changed the part of him that could still pretend to be separate. He had carried a lantern, a compass, a notebook. He carried none of them now. The lantern did not mind. The compass had remembered its oldest star. The notebook had taught him what a blank page can hold. He felt them beside him as old companions who understand the hour when talking ends. When he rose, if rising describes the way water returns to the level it was meant for, the chamber did not let him go because it had never held him. He moved as far as a breath moves within a chest. He reached the seam again, the gentlest decrease in presence, and placed his forehead there as one presses a kiss to a sleeping brow. He did not step out. He did not step in. He remained in the only place a vow knows how to keep, precisely where it is offered. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was meant to be entered by those who could become as patient as stone and as soft as water. The breath beneath the desert continued, uncounted, unhurried. The scholar received one more measure of it, then another, until his own breath and the chamber's were the same length. It was not a union. It was a remembering. Without light, the room had remained radiant. Without a name, he remained himself. Without a door, the promise remained kept. Above, the first inquiry of day touched the lion's gaze. Below, the chamber held the light it did not need. He did not think of leaving. He let leaving think of him and pass by. The world would continue to wake. The Sphinx would continue to keep the seam between day and day. The river under the desert would continue to practice moving without being seen. The scholar let his shoulders fall. He let his eyes remain open inside the dark. He let the oldest story choose its own last line. It arrived without words. The room breathed. He breathed. The plateau breathed. Silence arranged itself like linens over a sleeping child. Nothing closed. Nothing ended. The chamber that breathes without light continued to breathe, and in that breath he was held, and in that holding he became the quiet he had come to hear. In 1978, under the glow of scientific curiosity, sound engineers placed equipment near the Sphinx. They discovered something astonishing. The stone amplified even the faintest echoes, vibrating like the shell of a vast instrument. The ancient builders had not only shaped the visible world, they had tuned the invisible one. It was as if the desert could still sing, if one only knew how to listen. A lone figure enters this silence now, the same nameless scholar who once knelt before the paws of the Sphinx. His lantern flickers as he steps closer to the southern flank, where ancient inscriptions crumble under the night wind. The earth beneath him feels hollow, subtly trembling. He kneels, pressing his ear to the sand. What he hears is not sound, but memory, a hum older than language, the ghost of 1,000 forgotten prayers. The wind passes through the hollow spaces beneath the plateau, and the sound becomes something more than air. It becomes breath, voice, lament. The scholar feels it through the ribs of the earth, the echo of those who carved, who prayed, who vanished. He remembers reading of the temple of the Sphinx, unearthed by Auguste Mariette in the 19th century, where blocks of limestone bear the marks of copper chisels, each stroke echoing like heartbeat upon stone. He imagines the workers in torchlight, their chants blending with the ring of hammer and dust, shaping both monument and silence. He begins to hum softly, as if testing the air. The note wavers, then returns to him, changed, deeper, older, echoing as though the desert itself has remembered the tone. It is said that sound never truly dies. It merely grows too faint for our mortal ears. And here, beneath these stones, even the oldest voice seems to wait for someone to answer. The scholar closes his eyes. The resonance grows, soft at first, then surrounding him entirely, a sphere of invisible sound. The desert hums, the stars tremble, the very breath of Egypt seems to rise once more. He senses that what sleeps beneath is not a secret chamber of treasures, but a vault of vibration, the lingering harmony between human devotion and the cosmos that received it. The torch flickers lower. Shadows dance along the limestone walls, and for a brief moment he sees forms within them, outlines of priests, builders, stonemasons. They do not move as living beings but as echoes, their gestures looping endlessly like music trapped in stone. The scholar realizes he is standing inside the memory of sound, the chamber of echoes where every word, every prayer, every sigh has gathered like sediment of the soul. He feels tears form, not of sadness, but of reverence. This place is not haunted by death. It is alive with remembering. The wind calms. The silence after the echo feels like a heartbeat pausing between worlds. The scholar bows his head and speaks a single word, barely above a breath. The sound disappears into the sand, swallowed whole. Yet he knows it will remain, suspended forever in the echoing chambers of the earth, waiting for another to arrive. Another who will listen, not with ears, but with awe. The lantern fades. The desert becomes one breath again, ancient, unbroken, listening. Perhaps this is what the Sphinx was guarding all along. Not a secret, not a tomb, but the echo of creation itself. Night thins to a blue hush, and the first breath of dawn gathers along the ridge of the desert like a veil just lifted. The Sphinx holds the horizon in its steady gaze, as if waiting for the sky to speak its ancient name. In this pale hour, the stone seems lighter, more luminous, and every grain of sand carries a quiet glimmer, as though it remembers how to be starlight. The scholar returns to the plateau with an empty mind and open hands, seeking not answers but alignment, a way to stand where earth and heaven once met and recognized each other. He has read of old measures and celestial paths traced in dust, how surveyors in the old kingdom watched the procession of stars to set true north, how priests listened to the night to hear where a temple should breathe. He thinks of the valley temple east of the Sphinx, its massive limestone blocks sitting like soft thunder by the ancient edge of the Nile, and of the long causeway leading toward the Pyramid of Khafre. He imagines a time when water glittered here at dawn, and when the first light spilling over the desert bathed both stone and river in the same gentle fire. He has seen sketches of the granite dream stele, placed between the paws by Thutmose IV, and he wonders if all such stelae are really mirrors, not of faces, but of vows made between mortals and the sky. The air is clear enough to taste. Above him, Orion's belt fades slowly into the pale, but its geometry lingers, 3 quiet notes on a celestial harp. Some researchers have proposed that the pattern of the 3 great pyramids echoes those stars, not as a perfect copy, but as an earthly conversation with the heavens. Others speak of solstice lines and equinoctial risings, of temples aligned to the first breath of morning. The scholar lets the ideas drift like incense and does not cling. He only stands where the Sphinx looks, letting his own gaze rest in the same far distance, where sand becomes light and light becomes sky. He unrolls a small sheet from his notebook and draws a simple shape: a triangle for a pyramid, a line for the causeway, a circle for the place where he stands. Then, with slow care, he adds 3 points above the page. Not ink at all, but his fingertip held in air, marking the stars as if the air were an invisible parchment. The gesture is childlike, ceremonial. The desert accepts this quiet game. A breeze passes, barely enough to stir the lantern flame, and somewhere in the silence a lark begins to thread the morning. He remembers the ancient word for temple as a house of life, a place where the breath of the god could dwell. He thinks of the Sphinx as a threshold, a gate that does not open and close but simply stands where realms touch. Lion body, human face, horizon soul. When he closes his eyes, he can feel the line running through him, from the bedrock beneath his feet up through his spine to the thinning stars. He has read of precession, the slow turning of the Earth's axis that changes the sky over long ages, and he wonders how the heavens looked to the first carvers. Perhaps the great beast once woke to a sky not exactly like this one. Yet the conversation remained, like two old friends whose voices alter, but whose meaning never does. Across the sand, the first sunlight gathers like spilled milk on a dark table. The limestone blushes. The statue's face receives the day, and the scholar draws a breath that feels borrowed, as if the stone had breathed first and shared a portion with him. He thinks of the floor levels discovered by excavators, the weathered courses where water once pooled, of the blocks quarried from the Sphinx enclosure and lifted into place at the neighboring temples. The more he considers, the more the whole plateau feels like a single instrument tuned to sky time. Pylons as notes, causeways as staves, courtyards as moments of held silence where the music rests, listening for itself. He takes a step to the east, then another to the south, searching for the angle where a private alignment reveals itself. It is not a calculation. It is a feeling, a soft settling in the body, like standing where a river once flowed and hearing it again, deep under the sand. Here, the shadow of the Sphinx stretches behind him in a long, cool breath. Here, the sky seems to tilt gently toward the earth, as if to whisper. He lifts his notebook not to write, but to hold it flat in his hands like an offering. The rising sun spills across the page, and the blank sheet becomes a pale mirror. For a heartbeat, he sees the pyramid's edge and the curve of the desert reflected on that fragile surface, a modest echo of greater mirrors made of stone and light. Some say a mirror reveals only what stands before it. Others know that true mirrors remember. The scholar recalls a chapel inscription describing the horizon as the place where the sun is reborn, the moment when the day's name is spoken aloud. He lets the thought settle like a feather. He does not need to prove anything. He is only here to practice the old devotion, to learn how to let the world and the sky see each other through him. The wind lifts the fine dust at his feet and lets it fall in a slow spiral. He watches the tiny vortex dissolve and wonders if the ancients watched such small dances with the same reverence they gave to constellations. In the turning of a handful of sand, he feels the turning of the earth. In the gold veil of dawn, the soft mercy of time. He remembers the old myth of the first time, when the world rose out of the primeval waters, and a mound appeared where the sun could rest its first light. Standing here, among weathered walls and star-marked air, the story no longer feels remote. The mound is this ground. The first light is this light. He closes his eyes and breathes with the stone. The rhythm is unhurried, oceanic, the same pulse he felt beneath the pause in the night. When he opens his eyes again, the day has clarified. The Sphinx no longer appears to watch him. It watches through him, beyond him, as if he were a passing ripple on an older tide. The scholar lowers the notebook and lets the page remain empty. The truest map, he understands, is not the one that shows the chamber or the stair, but the one that shows how a human chest can learn to rise and fall in time with a horizon. Perhaps this is all the mirror was ever meant to do, to teach Earth how to hold the sky without owning it, to teach the sky how to lean down and bless the stone without claiming it. The plateau brightens. The river, far off, takes the sun into its skin and returns it in a shimmer. Lions no longer walk these banks, but their memory lingers in the lion body that watches, patient and immense. The scholar bows not to worship an answer, but to honor a question that has chosen to keep breathing. He turns to go, and the sand records his brief passage with a soft, erasing hand. Behind him, the Sphinx continues to hold its calm alignment. Ahead of him, the day opens like a gate. Somewhere between them, quiet as a secret, the mirror remains. Not in the stone, not in the sky, but in the space where both become one long lucid breath. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was only meant to be seen. The desert sleeps beneath a veil of wind, yet the Sphinx does not close its eyes. It has never slept, only dreamed. For thousands of years, through conquest and silence, it has watched the stars move like slow embers above the plateau. Its face, half worn by sand and time, still keeps the calm of something that has seen the gods come and go. They say there was a time when the Sphinx was not buried but radiant. Its body painted red with ochre, its head crowned in gold. The morning sun would strike its brow, and the whole figure glowed like fire upon the horizon. It was not just a monument then, but a guardian between two worlds, the desert and the river, the living and the eternal. It was during one of those ancient dawns, around the year 1400 BCE, that a young prince named Thutmose wandered across the plateau. He was not yet a king. His father, Amenhotep II, ruled Egypt with the strength of a warrior, and the prince was one of many sons who dreamed of being chosen. Tired from the hunt and the heat, Thutmose rested in the shadow of the great lion carved from bedrock. The sand had already begun to swallow the statue's body. Only its head rose above the dunes, gazing toward the rising sun. The story comes to us through the granite stele still standing between the Sphinx's paws, the dream stele, discovered by archaeologist Giovanni Caviglia in 1818 and later studied by Auguste Mariette. Its hieroglyphs, worn by centuries of wind, tell a simple and astonishing tale, that the Sphinx spoke to the sleeping prince in a dream. Thutmose lay in the sand as the midday heat shimmered like glass. He closed his eyes, and in that suspended silence, the desert breathed. Then a voice, deep, patient, resonant like stone, called him by name. "Look upon me, my son. I am your father, Hormikit Kepriare Adam, the sun in the horizon. The sand has covered me. Free me, and I shall give you the kingship over the land of the living." The prince awoke trembling. The dunes had not moved, yet he felt their weight. He rose, looked upon the massive face, and knew that his life had changed. Within that single dream, the divine order Ma'at had chosen him. Years later, when he ascended the throne as Thutmose IV, he fulfilled his vow. He commanded that the Sphinx be cleared of sand, its temples restored, its image honored once more. Between its paws he placed the stele of red granite, engraved with the story of that dream. The monument still stands today, silent yet speaking. Some modern scholars believe the stele was both memory and message, a way for the king to affirm divine right, to root his power in a vision of sacred destiny. But even if the tale was politics wrapped in poetry, there is something timeless in its rhythm. A dream once dreamt can shape an empire. The Sphinx remained, breathing beneath its new coat of light. Centuries passed, dynasties fell, the gold faded, the paint turned to dust. The desert reclaimed what devotion had revealed. Yet the stele endured, half buried, half seen, whispering to the winds that swept the plateau. At dusk, the scholar, the same one who had knelt at the pause, who had listened for echoes in stone, returns again. He traces the faint hieroglyphs on the stele, feeling the grooves cut by ancient hands. The words seem to hum softly under his fingers. He imagines the young prince asleep at this very place, the world suspended in golden stillness. The Sphinx, too, must have dreamed that day of freedom, of breath, of being seen again. As the sun dips, the limestone face glows faintly rose, as if remembering that forgotten promise. The scholar closes his eyes and listens. The wind sighs through the hollow around the monument. For a moment, it almost sounds like the voice that spoke to the prince. Not in words, but in feeling. He thinks of how the dream traveled through centuries, from Thutmose's heart to the stone beneath his hands, to the eyes of travelers who still come seeking silence. He understands that history itself is a form of dreaming, the way memory keeps breathing under the sand, waiting to be awakened by wonder. When the stars rise, the plateau becomes a sea of shadows and whispers. The Sphinx looks east, toward the place where light will be born again. Its eyes, though blind with time, still shimmer faintly with the reflection of that one promise. that to awaken what is buried is not to disturb it, but to set it free. The scholar exhales, slow and reverent, and somewhere between breath and silence, the lion dreams again. The desert keeps certain faces and forgets certain names. At the edge of the Sphinx enclosure, where the bedrock falls away into a shallow trench and wind gathers like a low chant, a man once stood with a staff and a small brass lamp. By daylight he was a watchman, a quiet silhouette crossing from the valley temple's shadow to the causeway's pale ribbon. Eyes steady, steps unhurried. By night he became something else, a line between worlds. The archaeologists who came in their seasons learned to nod to him, to share tea boiled dark and sweet, to trust that nothing would be harmed under his gaze. They called him Gaffer, as generations had called those who watched over ancient stone. He never corrected them. A title is a garment. He wore it lightly. The truth was older than any word they had. He knew where the limestone sweats at dawn, where the blocks cut from the Sphinx trench were once set back into neighboring walls, how the steps of the old kingdom still whisper under sand when a heel finds the right hollow. He knew the shallow depressions that fill after rare desert rain and reflect the statue's chin like a small moon. He knew the voice of the plateau when the buses were gone and the wind returned, a voice that sounded not like emptiness but like breath held in a chest too large to measure. He had been a boy when restorers brushed the dream steel and a man when conservators mapped fissures with careful hands. The names in their reports faded. The sound the stone made when evening cooled it did not. A door can be stone and hinge. A door can also be a moment. The keeper had learned to stand where moments opened. Just after sunset, when the color leaves the desert like smoke rising, he would pause by the Sphinx's southern flank and let his shadow fall across the bedrock. Below that line, somewhere in the quiet subsoil, instruments once registered small anomalies. Pockets that answered a tap with hollower breath, regions that trembled differently under a careful pulse of sound. Decades ago, visiting teams spoke of cavities. Others answered with caution and charts. The arguments drifted away like scaffolding after a restoration. What remained was the felt sense that the ground kept memory the way a sealed room keeps cool air. He did not argue with visitors. He offered directions and water, the kindness born of long horizons. If they asked what he guarded, he smiled and said, "The hours." He would lift his lamp and trace a slow circle, showing how the sky turned and the monument did not, how the lion body and human face fixed their attention on that single seam where day is born. When small children came and stared at the broken nose and the patient mouth, he told them this was the eldest teacher he knew. It taught waiting. When old women came wrapped in quiet and touched the limestone lightly with 2 fingers, he bowed his head as if to a priest. Some evenings he walked the length of the causeway and counted his steps. The count changed with drifting sand, like a prayer you never finish the same way twice. The valley temple sat with its megaliths pressed close, those giant blocks quarried from the very trench that held the Sphinx like a thought returned to itself. On warm nights, the stones kept their heat until midnight. He leaned his back against them and felt an ancient fire pass through his shirt. The moon would lift and the plateau would become an ocean made of chalk and shadow. In that sea he listened for the moment when air and earth aligned, the way a door aligns when a key approaches. He had a small book in his pocket, worn thin, the pages crowded with dates and small drawings. A cartouche traced by dull pencil. A little plan of the enclosure, not to scale, only to remember. He had once copied, painstakingly, a line from a scholar's article about Thutmose's restoration. Not the politics, not the chronology, but the single phrase, "to free the body from the sand." That line lived in him as a vow. He thought of all the hands that had freed, then watched the sand return. He thought of the chipped repairs, the plastered paw, the fragments reseated like teeth in an old jaw. He thought of Salim Hassan's trenches, of Mariette's discoveries, of Barai's lifting sand like lifting sleep from a face. The plateau had been woken and lulled, for more than a century. To guard, he decided, was not to keep people out. It was to keep the breathing steady. At times tourists asked if there was a hidden door in the Sphinx. He would tilt his head toward the dream steel and tell a story instead. A prince fell asleep, a god spoke, a promise was made, and when day returned, men cleared sand. The only door that mattered had opened in the chest of a young man on a hot day. If a slab swung inward somewhere under the pause, if a passage turned, if a threshold waited under hardpan and dust, it would not answer a hand impatient for spectacle. Doors love vows. They feel for the weight of a true intention. He had seen this in the simplest way, how a corroded lock in a village gate would yield to a grandmother's touch and resist a strong soldier's shove. Metal listens. Stone listens. The sky listens most of all. Near midnight, when even the dogs in the village below stopped their last conversations and the plateau floated, he would sometimes light the lamp and walk to a place only he visited. At the trench's eastern curve, a depression no deeper than a sleeping body's hollow held a darkness that did not move with wind. He would stand there and say nothing for 10 breaths. If the 10th breath grew longer on its own, if his chest forgot to empty, he knew the night had opened. In such openings he would remember the old words, Ka, the life breath, Ren, the name, Shut, the shadow that keeps a person's outline among the living. He felt, not thought, that the monument carried all three for a nation that had become a story and refused to be only a story. The Sphinx breathed for those who no longer could. It kept a name that had been ground thin by centuries, cast a shadow no wind could erase. The hidden door, then, was not a panel veiled by drifts. It was the moment a person's breathing slowed to match the desert's, the instant a gaze stopped demanding and started receiving. He had seen it open in a girl who came with a sketchbook and forgot to draw. He had seen it open in a mason from Cairo who laid his palm to the stone and wept once without sound. He had seen it open in himself when he was young and thought he needed to prove that the ground held secrets. Age taught him the sweeter lesson. The ground holds promises, and promises do not need proof, only guardians. Toward the end of his years, a new team arrived with gentler instruments. They spoke softly, they closed their cases carefully, they nodded to the old watchman as if to a colleague. He showed them where the wind changed tone after sunset, where the dust lifted in spirals that vanished as if pulled downward by an invisible stare. They made no claims. He was grateful. At parting, one of them pressed a folded paper into his hand. A simple diagram, a suggestion of layering beneath the bedrock, nothing more than lines and a dotted oval. He placed it in his little book beside the copied phrase. Paper can lie, breath cannot. Still, he kept it. Every promise likes to see its reflection, even if only in pencil. On his last night walking the circuit, he stopped by the pause and let the lamplight touch the granite steel. The letters were tired. The meaning was awake. He bowed, not from habit, but as one bows to a sleeping child who must not be stirred and must not be left alone. The lamp's flame made a small doorway on the stone and then went out. He did not relight it. The stars were sufficient. He stood until the seam of morning paled, until the lion face received the first question of day. Perhaps nothing was ever hidden. Perhaps it was always the door that kept us. He placed his palm on the limestone and felt the cool, even pulse of a body that had learned, across 5,000 dawns, to wait. Somewhere beneath his hand and beneath that waiting, a chamber or a memory or both remained, not refusing discovery, only requiring that those who approach remember how to breathe. The desert kept the man's face and forgot his name. The hours continued to turn like a key in an infinite lock. And the door, wherever it was, stayed just open enough for the faithful to pass through, carrying nothing but a slow heart and a listening silence. The scholar awoke before dawn. The air was cold, thin, full of dust and silence. The stars still trembled above the Giza plateau, pale threads across an unending canvas of night. Beyond the outline of the Sphinx, the eastern horizon waited, still, patient, ancient. He had dreamed again, but this time it was not of stone or sand. It was of light. In the dream, a map had unfolded, not of roads or rivers, but of stars. Lines drawn in silver flame connected constellations across the sky, then descended, shimmering, onto the surface of the earth. When he woke, that light still lingered in his eyes. He knew what it meant. The pattern he had sensed beneath the Sphinx was not only carved in limestone. It was mirrored in the heavens. He rose and walked toward the small tent where his notes lay scattered. On a yellowed sheet rested an old copy of a translation of the pyramid texts, spells from the Old Kingdom, carved more than 4,000 years ago. One verse had always haunted him. The sky is written in water, and the earth is its reflection. The priests of Heliopolis, he remembered, believed the stars were the souls of the justified, the Ak shining eternally in the field of offerings. He traced his finger along the map he had drawn days earlier, a sketch of the Sphinx, the pyramids, and the plateau. The alignment was undeniable. 3 great monuments laid in correspondence with Orion's belt. But now, something deeper stirred in his thoughts. What if the chamber beneath the Sphinx was not a tomb or vault at all, but a celestial chart, a mirror of the heavens carved within the earth? He recalled how the ancient architects, the priests of Seshet, goddess of measurement and writing, were said to stretch the cord, aligning temples with the rising of particular stars. Even the word they used for architecture, Tamari, the beloved land, spoke of balance between sky and soil. To build was to remember, to measure was to pray. As the first light began to gather along the desert's edge, the scholar walked to the western side of the Sphinx, where shadows still slept. He set his lantern on the ground and opened his notebook. From within its pages, a small parchment slipped loose, a tracing he had made from a forgotten codex in an Alexandria archive. The codex spoke of a celestial geometry, hidden under the paws of the lion, drawn by a cartographer who mapped the light that falls through stone. The author's name had been lost to mildew and time. He knelt in the sand, breath slow, hand steady. The wind was still. He placed the tracing beside the map of Orion. The angles matched, not perfectly, but like a melody half-remembered. He felt the hum beneath the limestone again, that subtle resonance, as if the plateau itself recognized its own reflection. A memory surfaced. In the late 1960s, seismic surveys beneath the Sphinx had suggested anomalies, pockets of density, as though hollow spaces ran deep below the monument. Some dismissed them as natural fissures. Others quietly had wondered. He thought of those readings now as coordinates, not of chambers but of alignment points. The desert was not empty. It was full of equations written in sand and silence. The scholar drew new lines, connecting each pyramid to a star, each star to a stone, each stone to a pulse he could almost feel beneath his palm. The geometry spiraled inward, forming what looked less like a plan and more like a mandala. He felt as if he were not discovering but remembering, something older than the empires, older even than the gods they named. The sun lifted its edge above the horizon. The Sphinx turned gold. The scholar's shadow fell across the sand like an arm tracing the curve of the earth. In that moment he understood why the ancients had worshipped light not as fire but as order, the breath that binds heaven and earth in silent harmony. Every sunrise was a renewal of that covenant, every shadow a record of it. He reached into his satchel and took out a small brass compass, its glass cracked from years of travel. He placed it upon the sand. The needle quivered, then stilled, pointing not north, but slightly east of it, toward the line of pyramids. He realized, almost smiling, that even metal long accustomed to direction had remembered its origin, the sun. The air warmed, the plateau shimmered. He closed his eyes, and in the red darkness behind his lids, he saw the pattern once more. Stars like embers drifting downward, forming rivers of light beneath the ground. The cartographer of forgotten light, whoever he was, had not drawn for kings or scholars. He had drawn for time itself, mapping the way memory travels between sky and stone. When he opened his eyes again, the light had changed. The Sphinx was no longer only monument but mirror, its golden face reflecting a sun that had been rising and setting for 5 millennia, unchanged, unhurried. The scholar whispered a verse from the pyramid texts, one he barely remembered, but the sound of it calmed the sand. May you rise as the light rises. May your shadow never fall. He closed his notebook gently and pressed his palm to the ground. Beneath his touch, the faint hum of the plateau answered, patient, eternal. The map was complete, though no one else would ever see it. Not a chart of stars or stone, but a map of breath, the one drawn between knowing and wonder. The desert glittered faintly with the reflection of the sky, and somewhere beneath, in chambers or in silence, the light kept shining. Night loosens its hold, and the first faint gray touches the quarry scars like cool fingers on a fevered brow. The Sphinx lies quiet, but the plateau around it remembers a music made of hands and breath. Before the monuments belonged to postcards and timetables, they belonged to calluses, to copper shining dull in the dawn, to the steady patience of men and women who gave the stone its voice. No roll of kings keeps their names. The limestone remembers them anyway. They came in seasons, in crews that left red marks on blocks and jokes in charcoal beneath lintels never meant to be seen. Some wore amulets of taret for the safe keeping of children. Some tied scraps of linen on their wrists for luck. Most carried nothing but a mallet and the long rhythm of a day that started with the low horn at sunrise. The Valley Temple felt their footfall first. Those monoliths, quarried from the very trench that cradles the Sphinx, still hold the quiet heat of their labor. Copper chisels sang against stone. Dolerite pounders thudded like slow drums. Sledges slid on dampened sand. A thin skin of water poured by boys who learned early that a drop can lift a mountain if given at the right time. The scholar stands where the trench breathes coolest just before day. He lays a palm on the cut face of the enclosure and feels a memory rising from within it. Not a story told aloud, but a cadence you recognize without knowing why. Salim Hassan once mapped these courses, counting layers like rosary beads of limestone. Auguste Mariette traced the nearby temple walls. Later, Mark Lehner read in The Workman's Village the culture of bread and beer and duty that fed the hands that shaped the horizon. The scholar thinks of bread ovens still outlining their circles in the ground, of copper scraps hammered bright again and again, of reed pens ticking off rations. Garlic, onions, grain. He thinks of crew names painted on blocks at Giza, the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkor, and wonders what playful title the Sphinx carvers would have chosen for themselves when the foreman turned his back. He closes his eyes and hears a hymn without words. It begins at the quarry face with the soft percussion of dolerite against limestone, a heartbeat measured to the length of breath. Two men trade the stone between them in a gravity no scribe could count. One chips the eris, the other keeps the edge honest with a copper bite and a wetted sand that drinks the dust. A third smooths with sandstone and spit, whispering to the surface as if it could be soothed. When the block yields, a sledge receives it. Rope braids bite shoulders. A runner goes ahead with a jar of water. The sand darkens in a shining path. The line moves like a slow river toward the Valley Temple, where the block will become part of a wall that holds cool air the way a chest holds breath. Above, at the Sphinx's base, a different music. Not blocks now, but skin. The plateau is an instrument. The enclosure a chamber that carries sound along its ribs. Copper and stone converse in a key made for gods. A master mason, gray at the temples, wrist strong as woven palm, sets a plumb by the lion's cheek. A boy steadies the string in wind. Behind them, a woman sifts lime dust for mortar, her hands chalked white, her eyes quick as a kestrel's. She hums the melody their grandchildren will hum without knowing where it came from. The face takes shape under that hum. The mouth learns patience. The eyes learn the far line where the sun becomes day. When the light strikes just so, the carvers lay down tools and stand with their foreheads leaning against the stone, as if finishing a sentence with their bodies. The scholar tastes grit on his tongue and opens his eyes to the pale. He thinks of paint once spread over the skin. Ochre red along the body, dark blue above the brow, gold leaf catching the morning like a promise. He thinks of repairs laid in later, paw-patched, jawline tended, every intervention a conversation across centuries. Restoration reports list fractures and fills. The wind lists persistent songs. Between them an unbroken vow, to keep the shape of breath where desert meets sky. Far down the causeway, the first calls rise from the village that served the plateau. Fires catch. The smell of barley and chaff drifts upward. A domestic incense that blesses work more intimately than any sacrifice. Dizzy with the hour, an apprentice carver rinses his hands in a basin, leaves fingerprints on a ledge that will sit hidden for 4,000 years. The limestone keeps them. In a corner, A tally scribe warms his pen and writes a short line in red to settle a joke between crews. Later rains will take it, but the laughter sinks into the block and stays. By midday the builders break beneath a strip of shade. Someone recounts how Thutmose slept at the pause and woke to a command. Someone else swears the Sphinx's breath cooled his neck on the hottest day last year. They do not argue. Work teaches one to let truths lie side by side like stones taking each other's weight. A mason mends a blister with a scrap of linen and leaves a knot that will fall into the trench when the line moves forward. A jackal prints its passing along the edge of the dig. The air tastes of copper and sun. Toward evening the hymn lowers to a murmur. The last finishing strokes on the day's cut sound softer, almost affectionate. A foreman takes a reed and checks a slope with a thread. Another man taps a wedge free like lifting a thorn from a great animal's paw. The tools withdraw. The stone keeps ringing a moment after the hands stop, as if remembering the exact shape of each touch. A thin curl of dust drifts along the cheek and settles in the hollow above the mouth. The builders watch it fall as if watching a child sleep. The scholar steps back from the wall and feels, with a small jolt, the alignment that has been guiding him like a steady star. The way every act here answers a larger order. The causeway to the temple to the river, the plumb line to the morning, the breath to the horizon. The hidden builders were not nameless to themselves. They moved inside a web of meaning that held them gently, like netting under a climber. They believed the work would outlast their sorrows, and it has. In the soft grammar of stone, their verbs still shine. To measure, to lift, to smooth, to rest. Dusk draws thin gold along the edge of the trench. The plateau cools like a pot set from fire to windowsill. The scholar presses his ear to the wall and listens. Even now, after dynasties, after conquerors, after quiet, there is the faintest answer, a low echo of 1,000 hands in one long chord. He does not try to separate notes. He lets the chord hold him up the way sound holds up a bird's wing when it finds the right angle of air.